I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. You know you should look away, but you can't. You are a witness to something horrible. It's something you'd never want to see happen to another human being in real life. And you certainly would never want it to happen to you. And yet, even if what you see goes against your basic human beliefs, you continue to watch. What you see makes you uncomfortable, but it also excites you. You can't stop watching. As you sit in the dark theater, you are repulsed by what you see, but you are also attracted to it. And you may say to yourself, what's a nice person like me doing watching a movie like this? The purpose of a good horror movie is to take us out of our comfort zones. Horror gives us the opportunity to confront our darkest emotions in a safe environment. We go to a horror movie to test our boundaries risk-free. We go to flirt with the forbidden, even the stuff that we forbid from ourselves. So what better way to do that than with a movie that mixes sex and violence? Sex and violence. Sex and violence. Just saying it can be hypnotic, can't it? Now, half of you just got uncomfortable, and the other half of you are leaning in. And that's understandable, because human beings have a complicated relationship with both sex and violence. That volatile combination is both provocative and controversial for most people, and with horror fans, even more so. Because when people think of sex and violence in movies, they think of horror movies first. Horror explores our primal anxieties, and sex and violence are about as primal as you can get. This combination might be considered a horror movie staple, but most horror films merely dabble in this mixture, and they shy away from any real risk. Only a few films dig deep enough to strike a nerve, to go beyond titillation, to blur any line between sex and violence, to take us to dark and uncomfortable places. Maybe even places that make us feel shame. Only a few horror films dare to get personal. These are sexual horror films, ones where sex and violence mix to create a disturbing hybrid. Now, before I go any further, a disclaimer or two. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a sex counselor or a psychiatrist. There are no letters after my last name. This isn't an academic profile out to prove a new sexual paradigm. I'm also not in the soul-saving business. I'm not here to do any sex shaming or be the morality police on anything. I am here to talk about what makes horror movies effective. No matter what the subject matter, horror's function is to surprise us and to disarm us. I'm fascinated by horror films that dare to go right to where we are the most vulnerable and make us sit in our anxiety. So why sex and violence? Who put this chocolate with this peanut butter? Well, sorry to put it to you like this, but it's always been with us. Sex and violence are interlinked in our brains. It's the dark side of our biology. Scientists discovered that even though these two behaviors seem like they're opposites, they both share the same part of the brain, the hypothalamic attack region. And that means they share the same neural circuits and the same intense arousal hormones. And to make it even more complicated, both behaviors release shots of dopamine and serotonin, the pleasure and reward drugs. Now, that doesn't mean we have a license to go around punching and fucking each other. There's another part of the brain that regulates that from happening. And if you can't self-regulate, society will be happy to regulate it for you. We are still ultimately responsible for the actions we choose. But I think it does legitimize why we sometimes get excited when sex and violence is combined in an image. When they mix, they pluck at those subconscious connections deep in the brain, and you may find yourself emotionally confused because a repugnant image turns you on, even just for a moment. When that happens, we experience conflicting emotions like anger or shock or shame. Conflicting emotions are the secret weapon of the horror film. A great example is the shower scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The scene starts with straight-up titillation with Janet Leigh in the shower. There is a sensual hiss of the water spray, and we see soap on her soft skin. But something happens long before the carnage starts. Except for that hiss of water, there is silence. We are in this silence for an unusual amount of time, secretly watching this naked woman. And the longer we sit in this silence, watching her, we get anxious. Is this arousal? Is this dread? Why are we already scared before anything happens? Whatever the emotional stew is, all of our receptors are wide open by the time we see the shadowy figure enter the room slowly. And then the shower curtain is violently pulled open and we hear that screeching music like an alarm just got tripped and we're caught in the act. And I think at that moment we get a double shot of dopamine because not only were we peeping in on a naked woman, we just got caught doing it by Mom. It's Mom Bates, but it's Mom. We aren't just scared. We are traumatized. Then we are terrified by a world-famous montage of a knife murder. But for me, I confess that one of those quick shots always hits me as erotic. It's a close-up of Marion Crane's belly, and the knife comes in from a side angle. It's not a stabbing angle. It's not a penetration angle. It's there to show you the size and the geography and the danger and the power of that knife up against that vulnerable belly. Something about how Marion Crane gasps and yelps in that shot and how her hand comes in to brush away the knife felt so sexual. Now, did Hitchcock intend to get a rise out of the audience, or was it an accident of editing? Am I perverted because I saw that moment as erotic? Well, perhaps, but it doesn't mean that I find every knife attack you see in horror films erotic. There's something about that specific image that wakes something up in my lizard brain, and it's very possible it may not do the same for you. And it's that doubt of whether the person next to you is going to think you're a pervert or not that makes people jumpy around the sex part of sex and violence. It's where we are all the most self-conscious and we are all the most vulnerable and where we are most likely to feel shame. Perfect breeding ground for horror. But accentuating the sexual nature of horror violence is always a risky proposition. Just ask director Michael Powell. Now with Hitchcock, most of the main characters in Hitchcock films are voyeurs or they lead secret lives. But Hitchcock, smartly, took the side of the voyeur in his films, and he made it acceptable for the audience to relate to them. He made voyeurs into innocent people whose curiosity just gets them into danger. Michael Powell, on the other hand, went right for the jugular, and it cost him his career. In his movie Peeping Tom, everyone is a voyeur, and he makes no excuses for them. Made in 1960, the same year as Psycho, this movie also had a lead character driven to madness by a domineering parent. But audiences were not about to give this character or Michael Powell any sympathy. Because from the first shot in the movie, Powell makes a connection between sex and violence and getting turned on by watching it. But he doesn't stop at saying that watching sex and violence is the turn on. Because everyone in the movie is a voyeur, and that includes even a blind woman. Now, she knows the main character is dangerous and hiding something, and yet she enters his lair anyway. And at a moment when she is trapped in a corner and the threat to her life is high, she gets turned on. And with that, the career of one of Britain's greatest directors got flushed right down the toilet. Speaking of that, do you know what image in Psycho got the most outrage in 1960? A shot of a toilet. Critics found that to be tasteless and vulgar, and they reprimanded Hitchcock for it. By introducing that blind woman into the mix, Michael Powell made the attraction to sex and violence more than just a visual thing. It was a sensation. It was an emotional response. It was an attraction to danger. It was an attraction to the threat of the forbidden. And a director who relished in tweaking Hitchcock's voyeur while blatantly piling on the sex and violence was Brian De Palma. Now, De Palma exploited how audiences got turned on by the dangerous and the forbidden by making his characters turned on by the dangerous and the forbidden. And he continued to do it even after he was called a pervert for doing it. His 1980 film, Dressed to Kill, is his most overt retelling of Hitchcock's Psycho. Critics at the time dismiss it as a tacky ripoff of Psycho, but I see it more as a parody of how people watch and interpret Psycho. People remember Psycho as rule-breaking and boundary-breaking, and that is rightfully so. But there's a heavy moral code at the center of Psycho that kept Hitchcock from getting crucified like Powell did. De Palma does it a little bit differently. At the very beginning of Dressed to Kill, De Palma gives us an eroticized shower sequence. A beautiful nude woman showers alone, and she's turning herself on with a bar of soap. It's a long scene that overtly titillates by showing full nudity. Suddenly, a hand covers her mouth, and she's attacked from behind, or so we think. It's actually her lover giving her one more sensuous poke of casual, anonymous sex. Now, the reason the gag works so well is because we've all seen Psycho, and we know what happens in a shower in movies like this. But see, De Palma isn't just updating the scenario for contemporary times. In this one scene, he tells us that demonizing voyeurism and casual sex is bullshit, and if you believe they are sins, you've been duped. Because the shower scene in Psycho is a shocker, but it is still essentially a retribution for a sinner. Marion Crane has sex with her boyfriend and then steals money at work and skips town. She's a sinner. In Dressed to Kill, the woman continues to have dangerous sex with strangers because it turns her on. And every time she does, we are sure the stranger is going to murder her. But it doesn't happen. Where's the retribution? It must be so frustrating for audience members who believe horror films are morality tales only. Finally, a sexually repressed killer slashes her to death while she's fully clothed in an elevator. Now, I don't want to give away the movie for those who haven't seen it, but let's just say there's a difference in the two movies that might seem small, but I think it's very important. See, Marion Crane is the only sinner in Psycho, outside of the insane Norman Bates. But in Dressed to Kill, everybody is an Old Testament sinner. In Psycho, the good-hearted boyfriend joins with Marion's straight-laced sister to play Hardy Boy to her Nancy Drew. In Dressed to Kill, they are replaced with a prostitute and a voyeuristic son who uses technology to spy on everybody. In Dressed to Kill, it's not sin that singles you out for retribution. It's a third party that decides that your particular sin deserves the death penalty. And that's the tip of the iceberg in how De Palma subverts the expectations of audiences who bought into the moral smokescreen Hitchcock used in Psycho. To really appreciate Dressed to Kill, watch the two movies as a double feature. I think it's also significant that Dressed to Kill comes out at the height of the slasher film. Because when people attack horror films about sex and violence, they're pointing directly at the ugly slasher film. And slasher films piss everybody off. Some say slashers are puritanical morality tales that say casual sex will be punished. Others say they undermine the puritanical morals of society. And even others say they promote violence against women. Me? I hate them because they're lazy. Not all of them, of course, but 95% of them are lazy horror films. First off, if you believe any of the complaints about slashers that I mentioned, I wouldn't argue with you. It was a template that was made to provoke, and when it got a strong response, filmmakers doubled down. And that template was so by the numbers, it got boring very quickly. See, to me, that's a problem. If you can make sex and violence boring, you've got a big problem. The honest truth is that even though they seem disturbing and offensive, slashers play it safe. They push the envelope with gore, but when it came to sex, they stop at titillation. I think there should be a distinction for slashers outside of the term sex and violence. I think they should be called nudity and violence films. You could cut out all the sexuality and it wouldn't harm the movie at all, and it might change the running time by 2 minutes tops. On the other hand, if you took out the violence, you'd have a boring 30-minute short film. And why is there such a disparity between sex and violence in these films? Well, because, wait for it, they didn't want to offend the audience. There is nothing safer than showing an audience predominantly made up of teenagers good old-fashioned nudity and good old-fashioned straight sex. It should be no surprise for anyone that we are much more comfortable with transgressive violence in movies than we are with transgressive sex. And And when slashers did occasionally veer out of the sex comfort zone, they became notorious, like the 1983 movie Sleepaway Camp. Now that movie is a by-the-numbers slasher, except for the last 10 seconds, which hops right out of the sex comfort zone and into horror infamy. It is still notorious and still remembered long after most other slashers have faded from memory. I think slashers were such easy targets for critics and social advocates because there was no purpose to the killing of women other than titillation. Now, die-hard slasher fans remind me that a lot of men get killed in these movies too, and they certainly do, sure. But just because men die too doesn't discount that there's violence to women. Men die in some of the most gruesome ways in these movies, but women get stalked, and then wounded, and then they beg and scream for mercy before they're killed. And it's that sadistic toying with them in the end. It's that abuse of power that feels very sexual. But hey, slasher fans, there's no need to be defensive on this with me or even apologize for it. I see nothing wrong with it because horror isn't a political party. Horror isn't an organized religion or a belief system. The purpose of horror is to confront our darkest emotions in a safe environment. We test our boundaries risk-free. We flirt with the forbidden. My only problem with you is if you take any of this into the real world. If you take it into the real world, my friend, I don't hashtag, I handicap you for life. My problem with slasher films is that they aren't scary, and they don't challenge the audience, and they play it safe. What the hell is the point of a horror film that does that? Sometimes it's not the violent act as much as it is the anticipation of the violent act. Two movies that I think are good examples of this are Brian De Palma's Body Double and Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Now, the irony isn't lost on me that both movies satirize and lampoon the sex and violence template of horror films. But both movies are also more effective and erotically charged than the traditional slasher films. In Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, there may be the most overt use of a weapon as a phallic symbol ever. The scene involves the lead character, Stretch, a long-legged woman in Daisy Dukes and cowboy boots, and Leatherface with his trusty chainsaw. After a very short chase, Stretch is trapped up against a wall. She's climbed up on top of a large ice chest that's full of beers, and she's forced to stay in a squat as Leatherface enters the room with his chainsaw right in front of her. He revs his chainsaw with the big blade aimed between her spread legs. She screams and she begs and she pleads while Leatherface continues to wave this whirling blade in her direction as a perverse threat. The more she screams and pleads, the more agitated and excited Leatherface gets. He holds the body of the saw at crotch level, and he dips the whirling blade into the ice and beer. Now Stretch is sprayed with a mixture of water and beer foam while she screams for mercy. The scene goes on so long that the absurdity turns into eroticism, and then it turns into something unsettling, and then it goes right back to absurdity. In a movie that's a satire of mindless horror movies, Tobe Hooper pushed the male domination sexual fantasy so far, he revealed it as silly, because most fantasies are silly in the light of day. Brian De Palma's Body Double is a movie about the illusion of sex and violence in movies, and the pivotal scene in the film was so controversial that critics called it pornographic. What's interesting is that there is no graphic violence shown on the screen. The scene involves a woman attacked by a man with the largest two-handed electric drill on the planet. It's a kind of drill you use to open old safes or oil derricks. So, if there's no graphic violence shown on screen, why did critics lose their minds? Because De Palma created a sequence that is 5 minutes of sadistic toying with a victim. It is in the performance of actress Deborah Shelton, who begs for mercy with really wide eyes and shakes. See, this isn't just a murder. This is someone being dominated against their will by a sadist who's just playing with her. It is so sexualized by how De Palma stages the sequence that if you remove the drill, it would still feel like a rape scene. Now, De Palma purposely made this scene as a fuck you to the critics who'd been calling him a sadist and a misogynist throughout his career. Body Double did nothing to change their opinions. Both Body Double and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 were satirical looks at sex and violence in horror movies, and both films struck a nerve by sexualizing the domination a sadist has over his victim. They show one person with power over another person's life and over another person's death, and they show it as an erotic high. Of course, there are horror films that take this idea very seriously. The Italian giallo film stylizes the sexual nature of sadistic violence into an art form, or it fetishizes the sexual nature of sadistic violence. A giallo film is ground zero for conflicting emotions about what you just watched. Most gialli are highly cinematic and gorgeous to look at, with gorgeous photography, gorgeous use of color, and have gorgeous women in them. At the same time, they are brutal and sadistic, and their primary focus, maybe their only focus, is violence on women. Women are strangled or stabbed or drowned by a signature killer who wears leather gloves. The killer in the giallo film is very hands-on. These murders are intimate. But it's not just the grotesque violence of the death that makes it intimate. The killer relishes in mentally torturing the victim, deliberately dragging out the inevitable until the victim is on the edge of madness. It's murder foreplay, and it's done with high-fashion artistry. If someone were to accuse the entire subgenre of misogyny, I couldn't argue with them. And yet, the fans that I know, and not all of them are male, are happily married and kind and sensitive and mostly progressive in their worldview. So why this weirdness out of their resume? Why this one strange thing that's out of place? Well, to them, this art form allows them to come to terms with a monster that lives deep inside them, because all of us have that monster. And finding a way to live with it in peace, that's what we do. One of the most wildly artistic and insane Italian movie directors is Dario Argento. Argento started his career in gialli and then moved into supernatural horror with legendary films like Suspiria. All his movies are punctuated with hypnotic camera work and nightmarish violence. And he wears his perversion like a crown. In any Argento film, he uses his hands, the director's hands, or the killer's hands on camera. So basically, he's tortured and murdered his ex-wife, actress Daria Nicolodi, twice on screen. In his 1987 film Opera, Argento came up with a very perverse twist on brutal sadism. Instead of driving the victim to the edge of madness before murdering them, this killer makes the victim watch as he murders other people. He literally forces the victim to watch. Well, how does he do that? He ties the victim up and then tapes a row of sewing needles beneath their eyes. To shut their eyes in horror is to tear their eyeballs to shreds with the needles. And the murders are very gruesome, and the killer laughs gleefully as he turns anyone he wants into an object or a plaything. We see close-ups of the victim's eyes with droplets of blood filling their lashes when they blink. Argento sexualizes the sadism so much, he turns the eyeball into an erogenous zone. Horror films allow us to safely confront our darkest thoughts and to test our boundaries. But sometimes a horror film goes to extremes to force us to reassess our boundaries and to shock us into examining our conscious thinking as well as our darkest thoughts. Is it surprising to you that sadism keeps coming up in this discussion? I think most of us fear a fate worse than death, more than we fear death itself. And having someone with the power to dehumanize us, to steal control of ourselves from us, is a fate worse than death. And it is truly frightening because that threat is horrifyingly real. And that extreme sense of danger can trigger excitement as well as terror. Easily one of the darkest emotional conflicts in cinema history is rape. Rape as titillation. It goes back as far as the silent films in movies like Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. It may be hard for anyone who is coming of age now to understand how rampant this was in movies back in the 1960s through the 1970s and even into the 1980s. It was even common in mainstream films. Even PG-rated westerns like The Outlaw Josie Wales included an obligatory rape scene. It was everywhere. Now, the culture's view on rape has changed considerably over the last few decades, and rape is taken much more seriously in films these days. But there have been far more that used rape for cheap shocks. Now, once again, I'm not here to be the morality police. The subject gets complicated because you can't say that horror allows us to confront our darkest thoughts and then exclude some of our darkest thoughts from the list. And since rape fantasies are a legitimate thing with some women, it's problematic to automatically discredit a scene for titillation without sex-shaming somebody. So, I'm a pragmatist. I'm not a moralist. I look at horror movies with rape in them the same way I do slasher films. Just like slasher films, when there was a strong response from citizen groups about rape scenes in movies, the filmmakers doubled down. And just like slasher films, a lot of these movies followed a lazy template. I don't see the point of a slasher film that isn't scary, doesn't challenge you, and plays it safe. If a rape is in a horror film and it doesn't scare you or challenge you and plays it safe, what is the point? A rape scene should punch you right in the balls, not blend together with the hundreds that came before it. Did you know that there are over 600 movies with rape scenes in them? When I ask people about gut punch rape, there are two movies that are always mentioned: John Borman's Deliverance and Gaspar Noé's Irreversible. Both films strip any titillation or fantasy from the rape. Both scenes take a long time to develop. You feel the threat escalate like a bad dream becoming real. They both amplify the loneliness and the terror of being helpless to stop your own violation. Even if you're normally excited by scenes like this, these movies can make you feel the true brutality beneath the fantasy. They remind you of where your boundaries are, like good horror should. And yet, you can still have conflicting emotions watching these films. But if you do, you'll know that you've come to your darkest thoughts honestly, not through fake romanticizing. A sign that times have changed is how rape revenge films are received. Back in 1978, when I Spit on Your Grave was known as Day of the Woman, the movie was considered vile garbage. The film has a tremendously brutal gang rape that lasts nearly 30 minutes, long past any chance of titillation. Now, the next 60 minutes of the film has the woman finding the men who did it and mutilating and torturing them, including a castration in a bathtub. Now, the movie has since been reassessed as a feminist film, supported by people like Carol Clover, who wrote Men, Women, and Chainsaws. I'm sure the empowerment brings with it conflicting emotions of repulsion as well as excitement. In the Soska sisters' American Mary, the title character is drugged and raped at a party by the surgeons at the hospital where she interns. Later, she enacts her revenge on the head surgeon with her own version of rape. The surgeon is bound and naked to an operating table. His head is immobilized, and a speculum is in his mouth and cranked wide open. Mary tells him how he is her new test subject for all forms of extreme body modification surgeries she wants to learn. Practice will make perfect, so he's going to come in handy for a very long time. Mary injects Novocaine in his tongue so he can't talk, but he can scream, and he demonstrates he can certainly cry. The scene is sexually charged by fetishizing the body and the threat of forced mutilation, and the forbidden danger of having your pound of flesh owned by somebody else. American Mary can be read as both a rape revenge film and a body horror film. Now, body horror almost can't help but have a sexual component to its violence. I mean, the title tells you where the focus and the anxiety are for the movies: the body and horror. But one body horror film stands in a category all its own, a movie that's giddy with obscenity. The movie is Brian Yuzna's body horror satire, Society. The movie is about how the grossly rich stay that way by sucking the poor dry, literally. In Society, the flesh of the obscenely rich is as twisted and corrupted as their souls and their sex lives, and their orifices are as pliable as their morals. Yeah, you heard me right. In this movie, the high society types get together for large orgies where they invite poor social climbers to join them. Now, what joining in for the thrill of the shunt means to be seen to be believed. The movie is full of surreal special effects that are both hilarious and sexually obscene, like a pornographic Hieronymus Bosch painting come to life. And that description either turns you completely off or has you scanning IMDb. Of course, I can't close a discussion about sexual horror without bringing up two films. Up until now, the movies I've discussed brought a sexual eroticism to their violent stories, or they satirize their collective obsession with sex and violence. But these two movies are bravely and openly about sex and sexual obsession. Instead of adding a little sex to the violence, these movies add a little violence to the sex. Okay, maybe more than a little violence. And in the process, they altered and expanded the boundaries of horror and welcomed in new fans. The movies are Clive Barker's Hellraiser and David Cronenberg's Videodrome. Sometimes similarities and connections only become obvious after the fact, like Black Sabbath putting horror story lyrics to loud guitars to create heavy metal. Looking back now, it seems like a no-brainer, but it was revolutionary at the time. It had never been done before. When I go to horror conventions, a lot of the people I meet are fans of both horror and heavy metal, and you see as many metal t-shirts as you do horror t-shirts. There are also a lot of tattoos, and a lot of them are horror movie related and heavy metal related, and some are tribal. And sometimes you see a bondage duck. It's a rubber ducky with a leather harness or a ball gag or a blindfold on it. Or you see people who have a heart with a keyhole in the center tattooed to their chests. Or you see someone with a tattoo made up of 3 connected spirals. Sometimes those spirals are just plain black ink. Sometimes they're made of thorny roses. Sometimes they're chains. These tattoos are subtle declarations that the person is a practitioner of the BDSM lifestyle. Bondage and discipline, or domination and submission, or sadism and masochism. Now, there are no absolutes, of course, but if you ask someone that has those tattoos what their favorite horror film is, chances are good they will either say Hellraiser or Videodrome. In a very general way, horror and heavy metal and BDSM allow us to release our dark side and test our boundaries in a safe environment. But until Clive Barker's Hellraiser, I would have never seen any connection. Now, Hellraiser isn't a movie about BDSM, and you don't need to be into BDSM to love it. Hellraiser delves into our anxieties around sex as a theme, not as a subplot. It was the first major horror film to openly be about sex outside of the safe comic book sex that was pandered in slasher films. It's said that there were numerous possibilities out there to test your boundaries against. And since this is a horror film, when you chase the darkness and the forbidden, you must make sure you don't go too far. The visual device that propels the metaphor is so simple and pure genius. It's an ornate black and gold Chinese puzzle box. You want to solve it because you know it holds the secrets of the darkest and the most forbidden pleasures. Now, the box really is the entry gate for the Cenobites, beings from another dimension who are devoted to pain as pleasure. Visually, they are a nightmare version of body modification taken to impossible extremes. Pinhead, the main Cenobite, with a grid of pins hammered into his head, is the embodiment of pleasure and pain, and attraction and repulsion. You have no idea that's what's waiting for you if you solve that puzzle. You experiment, and you experiment, trying different combinations, and the longer it takes to solve it, the more obsessed you get, the more you need. Every time you fail to solve it, it's your chance to walk away. But you choose to continue. And when you solve it, and it leads to your demise, you realize that you did it to yourself. For those of us who are attracted to the dark side of everything in life, this movie really resonated. Director David Cronenberg has been making movies about body horror his entire career. All his movies deal with how the body that contains you is in constant revolt from you. He sees sex as a revolutionary act. He sees aging and decay as a revolutionary act. He sees entropy and death as a revolutionary act. And when the sexually transmitted parasite from his film Shivers finally takes over the body of the hero, he considers that a happy ending. but I consider Videodrome to be his most subversive, revolutionary act. The movie is about overstimulation and addictions to sensation and addictions to the forbidden. Videodrome asks the question, why do you watch? And then it asks the question, why are you still watching? The story revolves around Max Wren, the owner of a cable company who specializes in subterranean video, softcore porn, and anything that can be pirated off the airwaves. His business meetings take place in flea-bag hotel rooms where men sell him videotapes in hand-drawn boxes. Max longs to find something harder with a bigger edge to show on his network. You get the feeling he wants it more for himself, so he can feel the sensation of the forbidden again. One day, his pirate satellite technician intercepts a broadcast of a feed that is of a woman in chains on an electrified clay wall who's being tortured to death. There is no plot, just extreme violence, just one set. It is called Videodrome, and there are rumors it is a live snuff show disguised as S&M. After Max watches Videodrome, he starts to have violent sexual hallucinations, and soon he can't tell what is reality and what is Videodrome. Cronenberg immerses us in a world of violence and sexual deviance, but he also makes a harsh comment about the debate around whether sex and violence in the media affects the real world. In Videodrome, he says the ship has already sailed, and reality has already been abandoned for the new hyperreality of the video world. In 1982, Cronenberg envisioned a world where people would immerse themselves in a video world of pure sensation rather than live in the world outside their door. And in this video world, you can have the sensation of murder without doing it yourself. And I'm going to stop here because you might be feeling that cold shiver down your neck I feel. In 1982, Videodrome was fiction. But now, Videodrome is a reality. And that's a conversation for another show. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hell-bent.